This is the Week 12 video lecture on the second part of animal ethics. So I'd like to begin by discussing Peter Singer's chapter from Animal Liberation called All Animals Are Equal. That was the assigned reading for this week. So Singer got pretty famous for this chapter in this book because he introduced the idea of speciesism. And this is directly related to the principle of equal consideration that he discusses earlier in the chapter. Now, the principle of equal consideration just says that everyone's interests ought to be considered equally. And insofar as suffering is the basis for interests, so everybody's suffering also ought to be considered equally. And so there are different offenses or different ways that we can violate the principle of equal consideration. If we choose not to consider somebody's interest equally because of their race, then we're being racist. If we choose not to consider somebody's interest equally because of their sex, then we're being sexist. And Singer talks about both of these kinds of cases. The new one that he introduces is the idea of being speciesist. And this would be an offense where we violate the principle of equal consideration due to somebody's species. So we choose not to take their consideration, or we choose not to take their interest into consideration because of their species, or because of our own species, because we think it's better than theirs. So there are two ways to commit this offense. There are two ways in order to be a speciesist. The first is to ignore the interests of other species completely. The second way is just to consider the interest of our own species as counting more or as being better than the interests of other species. And I want to give a quick example just to illustrate the difference between the two ways of being speciesist. So in the first case, we can imagine someone who's deciding on what to eat for dinner. They know that they want to have spaghetti, but they're trying to decide between just a traditional tomato sauce or a meat sauce. And so if this person just considers their own welfare when they're making the decision, they just decide that they would be happier if they had the meat sauce. It would taste better and would fill them up a little bit more. Then they're being speciesist. They've ignored the suffering that they will cause by creating more demand for meat. That is, they haven't taken into consideration the interest of the animals. In the second case, where we consider the interest of another species as just counting less as our own, we can use the same example, but right before deciding to reach for the meat sauce, the person considers the happiness of the animals that he's going to create demand for by eating that meat sauce, and he can think about, or she can think about her own welfare, and she might say that, this cow will suffer, but I'm going to taste something very delicious, and I'm going to be very full. And it is just a cow, so even though I would typically think of that suffering as mattering a lot, just because it's a cow, it doesn't matter as much as my own interest or my own happiness, and so I'm going to eat this meat sauce anyway. And in this case, we haven't ignored the interest of the animal. However, we've counted our own interest, our own human interests, as counting more than the interest of the cow. Let's see. And so, and these are two different cases. One in which we ignore the interest of the animals completely, and the second just where we consider our own interests as being more important than the interest of other species. And it's important to note that Singer just wants us to consider animals. That's his kind of main thesis. He doesn't want us to be speciesist. He doesn't want us to ignore them. He doesn't want us to count them as a lesser species. He just wants us to consider them as equal. That doesn't mean that they get a full body of rights, like as in the case in Regan. It just means that we ought to consider them when we start making our decisions. Before we discuss Regan's views on equality, I want to say something about the structure of Regan's paper. So Regan is arguing against a number of different views about the way that we should treat animals. And he's arguing against a lot of these views, and this is very important to pick up on. So Regan is not a utilitarian, he's not a contractarian, he does not endorse the cruelty-kindness view, and he does not endorse the indirect duty view. He's arguing against these four views. So it's important not to get confused and to accidentally attribute any of these views to Regan. So as I said, one of the views that he's critiquing is the utilitarian view of how we should treat animals. And Regan's basis for attacking this view is the utilitarian conception of equality. Now, if we remember, according to utilitarians, people are equal insofar as we treat their happiness or their welfare as equal. So according to utilitarianism, my own happiness is just as important as Obama's happiness, which is just as important as my dog's happiness. And so what Regan does is Regan rejects this view of equality entirely. He says that it's not our happiness or our welfare that's important, it's us, ourselves, that's important, and that's what should count equally, is that I should be equal to Obama, who should be equal to my dog, and that's what's important. And so Regan sets us up with this analogy. He says that we should imagine cups, and we should imagine the kinds of liquids that we put inside of cups. And according to the utilitarian, it's the liquid inside of the cup. It's how sweet or how bitter it is. And that's what's important. But utilitarians don't actually consider the cup itself important. It's just the thing inside of the cup. And likewise, for people, it's not the person themselves that are important. It's just the happiness or the unhappiness that's inside of me that counts for the utilitarian. And Regan argues against this view. He says it's not a very adequate view of equality. He argues instead that people are equal because they are experiencing subjects of life. And so I am an experiencing subject of a life. My dog is an experiencing subject of a life. Lobsters are experiencing subjects of life. And as a result, they all have inherent value. And anything that has inherent value equally. And so, all animals are equal, according to Regan. That's going to wrap it up for this week's discussion lecture. I'm happy to read your discussion posts, and I'm quite happy to read about what you think about Singer and his very famous article, and about Regan and his even more controversial article. We'll see you next week.